I'd like to introduce Dr. Thomas Hübl. He's a renowned teacher, author, and international facilitator whose lifelong work integrates the core insights of the great wisdom traditions and mysticism with discoveries of science. In 2004, he has taught and facilitated programs with more than 100,000 people worldwide, including online courses, which he began offering in 2008. The origin of his work and more than 2 decades of study and practice on healing collective trauma is detailed in his book, Healing Collective Trauma, a process for integrating our intergenerational and cultural wounds. Mysticism and principles that guide the actualization and the practice of embodying these profound experiences are at the heart of Thomas Hübl's teachings. In all his courses, participants can expect to learn from his extensive experience as a teacher of meditation and study of wisdom traditions. His didactic talks draw from evidence-based research and the leading edge of transpersonal interdisciplinary studies. And he was awarded PhD by Ubiquity University this year. Thomas, thank you so much for being with us. I know that you're traveling extensively, and we really appreciate that you made time to engage with us and have a discussion.
Thank you, Georgie. And thank you, Erwin and Alexander, for inviting me and the Laszlo Institute. And it's so great to listen to all the former speakers, David, Anna, Pavel, and Jude. And I will come back to some of the things you said, because I think it deeply connects to some of the things that I want to speak about. Since the early 2000s, when I came back from a 4-year meditation retreat, I started to give groups, and they grew pretty quickly. And in my groups, especially in the German-speaking part of Europe where it started, and from there everything expanded globally, I came across a phenomenon that I would love to share with you, because I think that that's at least one facet of what we are looking at today. And that was that I saw the recurrent emergence of collective trauma within a group consciousness that appeared over and over and over again. Currently, like, trauma is usually being seen as an individual experience, an overwhelming individual experience. But when we look a little bit more mystically at trauma, what happens is that presence in an overwhelming situation is being split into a past that immediately creates a mirror world, like a fake future. And that fake future is needed to integrate the past back into presence. So when we have a chunk of past, which means postponed experience, trauma is overload, so it's postponing experience. And I think a more ancient part of the word karma relates to that process. So then we have two, a question and an answer. But usually those are separate. Same as from that moment on, the word and the energy are two. And the more I studied collective trauma, I thought, it's very interesting. It's not only that we are traumatized by ourselves through certain overwhelming experiences. It's actually that we have been born into a world that has been traumatized for thousands of years, healed itself, has been traumatized again, healed itself. So there's a whole cycle of resilience, obviously, and traumatization. So when we speak about sentience, or when we speak about sensing, trauma is a distortion in our capacity to sense. And I will say what I mean by that. When I look, for example, at Alexander or at Georgie, the Alexander that I see, or the Thomas that you see when you listen to me, happens in your central nervous system. Of course, I'm also out here. I'm a particle out here, but I'm energy in everybody who's listening right now. I'm perception. So there is a Thomas who is a particle in a body, and there is a Thomas who is an information field in every brain listening to me right now. The more coherent is that field, the more present we are together, it creates intimacy. Why? It's like when you sit at the romantic summer night and you sit at the lake and you see the full moon, and you see the moon in the sky looks exactly like the moon on the water surface. That's intimacy. If the Thomas inside or the Alexander in me and the Alexander out there is pretty much equal, we call it intimacy. But trauma distorts the flow of information. What's information? Information. It's me having the capacity to be informed by you, which means I have a you inside of me, a form of you inside of me. Or I have a form of the world inside of me. Where I'm traumatized, I cannot feel you in me. I feel separate from. And as Jude beautifully already spoke about, the illusion of separation, is a function in my nervous system to absence my pain, to absence certain parts of life. And so when I kept on working on the collective trauma, I saw more and more, wow, like millions of people dying in the Second World War, millions of people in concentration camps left so much undigested, absent information that I have been born into, being born in Vienna after the Second World War. But nobody told me that many things that I saw and felt were actually after effects of that catastrophe. I just learned this as I grew up. I discovered this myself. And of course, there's the rational part, but then there is the embodied part of learning that is much more complex. And the reason why I'm saying that is that also in my book and in many of my talks, I'm a big advocate of talking about the systemic effect of traumatization onto our cultures, onto our organizations, onto different pillars of our society. Because the built-in illusion of separation is an illusion, but it's a truly felt function that is needed in us, because it's needed in overwhelming situations to shut down the pain to survive better. And I deeply am convinced that the fact that we didn't do the work necessary in Europe in the last 40 years to integrate the collective wound is the reason why we have another war right now. Because a certain amount of integration didn't happen. And so then it's interesting, what's integration? Integration is, or we can call it also post-traumatic learning, is us making space to reflect, to digest, and to integrate, which means learn. When we digest, we learn that the split of information that creates a layer of past is being brought back into presence. And I believe in order to make a step as societies, we need to reframe our notion of time. Because we might say history is behind us, like in the past. I would say no, history sits here as us. Integrated history is us. That's millions of years having this conversation right now. I didn't invent the liver. I didn't invent anger. I didn't invent many things that were naturally handed over to me by my ancestors. And so integrated history is not the past. Integrated history is presence. But unintegrated history is the past. And that's the past that interferes constantly, consciously or unconsciously, with my current experience. And that's why I think when we talk about sentience, when we talk about the evolution of consciousness, we also need to talk about the collective permafrost that is not joining the movement. Because if we say there's a natural drive to evolve, there's a natural drive to create habits. Activism is great to change habits. But activism is not great at all in healing trauma. Because if I push trauma, I create even more resistance. So when we talk about feedback loops that are needed, and when we talk about like more dialogue and more feedback, I completely agree, that's what we need. But the feedback can't happen where we are traumatized, because there it's naturally frozen. And we can call trauma reduced movement. Now the Tao Te Ching, a wisdom book that I very much appreciate, is speaking about Wu Wei. It's being immersed in the movement, where consciousness and sentience are not two. It's complete. The center, stillness, is in the center of movement. But in the reduction of movement, which is hurt, there is a difference of movement. That's what we feel, what we struggle with. Part of me is moving fast, part of me is moving slower. In between, there is tension. And when we look into our societies, it's the same. So I'm very curious, because healing, in my understanding, is the restoration of the original movement. And as Jude also said, that but collective trauma, we can't heal alone. So that means that healing is moving towards a collective dimension. Because trauma creates, what does trauma create? Hyperactivation, a crack, and numbness. So we have three elements: a lot of stress and reactivity, a crack in the screen, like somebody took a stone and threw it onto the window and you have a crack. It's two, and absence and numbness. And so it creates fragmentation. When we look into our society at the moment, we see a lot of polarization and fragmentation. These are natural trauma signs within our society, and social media and many other technologies, as we heard before, might just amplify that effect. So non-trauma informed social media or journalism is actually amplifying polarization and lowering public health, because it's not informing, it's playing on the hyperactivation and the numbness of society. So more clicks are not necessarily more healthy or more successful, sometimes even the opposite. It's detrimental to our collective health sometimes. But when we take it one step deeper and we look, what's actually underneath trauma? Underneath trauma is an ethical transgression. A lot of the trauma that we have, or what we see right now, is a transgression of the inherent human right, which is the natural flow of light embedded in the divine law. So if karma, a less and less karma-heavy transmission of life, is actually one that respects the flow of light from one generation to the next, the flow of conscious awareness or an aware process. And so underneath underneath the PTSD, the trauma, the attachment trauma, is actually a transgression of the divine law or the divine order. But that transgression is frozen in the ice. So what that means, as long as we don't de-ice, for example, millions of Jewish people in concentration camps and their pain, or slavery and racism, or colonialism, or genocides, or any other gender violence, massive transgressions against human rights. We have been born into massive transgressions. Not only that we committed those, it's like we have been born into a world where that kind of distortion is already going on. And I think it's our evolutionary imperative to learn, to harvest the unlearned learning of the past as much as we get inspired by the subtle whisper of our future. As mystics, when we are able to calm down our inner world, what do we do in order to kind of connect to the visionary dimension or the visions that have been spoken about? There is an inner equilibrium that allows us to listen to what I call the whisper, the subtle future that arises in presence, that is not a later point in time. The future never arrives tomorrow. Future always arrives now. It's being born out of presence. The imaginary future is tomorrow. That's when I cannot be present. That's why when I, as a practitioner, as a mystical practitioner, I'm asking how long is it still going to take my journey. I project my own mortality because I'm in a hurry. I'm projecting that onto God or onto the infinite, onto the ultimate. There is no end of the journey. Yeah, I'm having a limited time here. But if my time determines my journey, then I am already operating within the limitation of my own mortal self. And that's why one awakening or realization is that I transcend that mortal sense of self to really get in touch with the deeper underlying reality that many here and Erwin are talking already for a long time about, which is, I think, a deep immersion into a fundamental depth. And at the same time, we are being asked, in order to unify consciousness and sentience, we are being asked to restore ours or our ancestors or our cultures' ethical transgressions in order to unify the imaginary future, the pain of the past into presence, in order to truly be able to unify again the word and the energy. Let there be light means light and the word is the same. It's non-dual. Many things we talk about today in our world is we can talk about them, but we can't live them. So the word and the action are two. Because the embodied walking of the embodied word, like that knowledge can be separate from embodiment, is a collective trauma symptom that became so pandemic that we called it normal. And if I call the collective trauma symptoms that I have been born into normal, we don't take care of the wound. But if I call it by its name and I say, this is not how the world is, part of it is how the world is. These are evolutionary, emergent, relational, developing processes. But there are many repetitive, non-emergent, disrelated, repetitive processes that are not evolving. They're frozen in time. They're hostages of time. And first of all, our responsibility, ability to respond, is to notice those and to find the right way to integrate repetitive processes, to kind of liberate those from their nature as a hostage of time and bring them back into the present moment from which they can develop. And there's so much energy frozen in the collective trauma field in the entire world. If we were able to liberate that, that would bring back a lot of creativity. It would clear up the collective fog, because I believe we are using Zoom as a crutch to show us what we can do even without Zoom. But because of the density of all the disembodied information, we don't have access. It sometimes feels even hard to feel a person in the same room than somebody I think about on the other end of the planet. But skilled healers can tune in with that easily. So I think the capacity of our conscious sensing is so much higher. And I think taking care of the deep wounds that you can't see from outer space that this lovely blue planet has is also a highway to its development. So we're learning from the past, harvest the ethical transgressions to be able to deal with the current AI, science, genetic engineering. This needs all the ethical learning that are still frozen in the permafrost of our past. So that's just a short overview of something that I think is important to